Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're headed across the ditch to New Zealand, diving into a whole bunch of recent news articles and reports to see what's been going on.
It's quite a mix, really. A real snapshot of a nation, well, in motion, I guess you could say. You've got heated parliamentary debates, new laws being passed, cultural celebrations, economic challenges, and even a whooping cough outbreak all happening at once.
Yeah, it's quite the collection of stories, and we're going to try to unpack as much as we can.
So good.
Let's kick things off with a piece of legislation that's been causing quite a stir over there, David Seymour's Treaty Principles Bill. Now, this bill has sparked protests, debates in Parliament, and it's really raising some pretty fundamental questions about New Zealand's national identity.
Yeah, this bill, it goes beyond just legal wording. It gets to the core of the relationship between the government and Maori, the indigenous people of New Zealand. Seymour, he argues that clarifying these treaty principles is crucial for moving forward as a nation. But a lot of people, they see it as a distraction from, more pressing economic issues. And some even say it could be harmful to the spirit of the Treaty of Waitangi, which is like this foundational document in New Zealand's history.
And it's interesting, Seymour is drawing a parallel between this bill and past social reforms, like the legalization of homosexuality in New Zealand. He's suggesting that sometimes to make progress, you need to have those tough conversations and kind of challenge the status quo.
It's a bold comparison for sure. It makes you wonder if this bill, could actually become one of those landmark pieces of legislation that shapes the future of race relations in New Zealand. I mean, the Treaty of Waitangi has always been open to interpretation, and this bill's bringing those different interpretations, well, right to the surface. Hence all the debate and protests.
And as this whole debate plays out, the New Zealand Parliament's been busy with other things, too.
Yeah.
Like, they've granted citizenship to some Samoans who were actually denied it historically. It seems like a significant step towards righting some past wrongs.
Oh, definitely. And it's part of this bigger trend, right? Nations are starting to really grapple with their colonial pasts and trying to address those historical injustices. This specific case, it involves Samoans who lost their New Zealand citizenship because of a law that, well, didn't mean to do that. It was unintentional. So this move is about like reconciliation and acknowledging the complexities of that shared history.
It's kind of like they're dealing with the past and the future at the same time, right? Like extending deadlines for earthquake-prone buildings, that's a pretty practical move, especially in a country that's so prone to earthquakes.
For sure, for sure. It's about balancing immediate needs with long-term planning, especially in a country that sits right on the Pacific Ring of Fire. They have to constantly adapt and be vigilant.
Yeah. And speaking of balancing priorities, New Zealand's also facing some environmental challenges. They recently dropped in the Climate Change Performance Index. And groups like Greenpeace, well, they've taken notice.
That drop in the rankings, it shows this tension that so many countries are feeling, right? This tension between environmental goals and economic realities. Greenpeace is particularly critical of the government's decision to lift the ban on oil and gas exploration. They say it just contradicts their climate goals.
Greenpeace is worried that these policy changes are giving too much power to polluting industries, and that it could even hurt New Zealand's image as a clean, green country. And that, of course, could have, consequences for trade and stuff.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that what a country does with its environmental policies can have a ripple effect. It impacts everything, from international relations to their economy. We're all so interconnected now. What one country does can influence others and even affect trade partnerships.
So true. And while they're trying to figure all that out, they're also dealing with things like public safety, which is a lot more immediate. Like in Auckland, they're taking steps to make things safer for bus drivers, which, makes sense in a city where so many people rely on public transportation.
It does. This initiative, it shows that people are more aware of the need to protect essential workers, especially the people who, well, keep vital services running. Installing protection screens, testing out live CCTV, even thinking about having dedicated toilet facilities for drivers. It's all aimed at improving working conditions and attracting more people to the profession.
It's funny how something as simple as putting screens on buses can reflect these bigger social trends. It's like a real-world example of how much more attention we're paying to the well-being of workers, especially after the pandemic and everything. We've all realized how important essential workers really are.
You're right. It's about recognizing that everyone plays a part in a healthy society. And that includes the people who keep things running, the bus drivers, the delivery people, the nurses, everyone. This focus on bus driver safety, It's just one example of a much bigger shift towards valuing those contributions and putting worker safety first.
Definitely. Now, switching gears a bit to something, well, a bit more sensitive. Let's talk about those proposed changes to name suppression laws for sexual offenses in New Zealand.
Right, right. These proposed changes, they're all about putting more emphasis on empowering the victims. The idea is to give victims more control, prevent further trauma, and encourage them to come forward and report these crimes.
Yeah, it's a really important shift towards acknowledging the impact these crimes have on victims, not just in the short term, but in the long term as well. Under these proposed rules, courts wouldn't be able to permanently suppress the name of a convicted offender without the victim's consent. Plus, all victims would automatically have their names suppressed.
Exactly. It's about shifting the balance of power within the justice system, putting the needs of the victims first. By giving victims more control over whether their names are made public, the hope is that it'll reduce the fear of being re-traumatized and empower them to seek justice.
It's a powerful change for sure. And this is all happening while they're also enacting the Gangs Act 2024, which has already led to, a bunch of arrests under Operation Nickel.
The Gangs Act and all the police action,
Yeah.
it shows they're serious about cracking down on gang activity, targeting the display of gang insignia, seizing all that gang-related stuff. It's all meant to disrupt their operations and send a clear message about the government's stance on public safety.
And of course, it's a move that's getting mixed reactions, as you can imagine. Law enforcement, they're emphasizing public safety. But you've got some gang members warning that it could actually lead to more violence. It's a tough situation.
It highlights this challenge, right? This challenge of keeping people safe while also respecting the rights of everyone, even those involved in criminal activities. The government's trying to walk this fine line. They want to address the concerns about gang violence without making those existing tensions worse.
It's a tough balance to strike. Okay, so let's shift gears again. Let's talk about something that's affecting everyone around the world, the decline of cash. Both Australia and New Zealand are facing this trend, and they're taking, well, pretty different approaches.
The whole shift towards digital transactions, it's reshaping how we think about money. And governments, they're trying to keep up. Australia, they're going to make it mandatory for essential goods providers to accept cash starting in 2026. And they're getting rid of checks completely. They're trying to protect the people who still rely on cash while accepting that, well, the future is probably going to be more digital.
And New Zealand's doing things a bit differently, right?
Yeah, New Zealand's focusing on making sure people can still access cash, especially in rural areas where internet access and stuff might not be as good. Plus, they're looking into the whole digital currency thing, which is pretty forward-thinking.
It's interesting, isn't it? Two neighboring countries, both dealing with the same trend, but in such different ways. Australia is taking this, more cautious approach, like they're trying to regulate things, while New Zealand seems more, open to embracing the new tech. It shows you how differently countries are approaching this transition to a less cash society.
Absolutely. They're both trying to find that balance between the convenience of digital payments
Yeah.
and the needs of the people who might get left behind in a fully cashless world.
Yeah, and here's something interesting. Even though people are using less cash in New Zealand, the actual amount of cash in circulation is going up. That's kind of strange, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it suggests that even though people aren't using cash as much for everyday purchases, they're still holding on to it. Maybe they see it as a safer bet, a hedge against uncertainty, or maybe they just prefer having physical money. Whatever the reason, it shows that this shift away from cash, it's complicated. Cash and digital payments are probably going to coexist for a while.
Yeah, for sure. The future of money is, well, it's still up in the air, and it'll likely involve a mix of old and new ways of doing things. Now let's shift our focus to something a bit different. Child welfare. New Zealand's just created a new Child Protection Investigation Unit.
This unit, it's a direct response to a Royal Commission report that exposed widespread abuse within state care. It's a clear sign that they're serious about addressing those systemic failures and prioritizing the well-being of children.
It seems like a really important step towards accountability and making real changes. The unit's independent from Oranga Tamariki, which is the government agency that's responsible for child protection. That independence is crucial, right? It means they can investigate without any bias or interference.
Exactly. Plus, they're not just looking at individual cases of abuse, they're focused on systemic reform. They're examining the policies, the practices, the whole culture that allowed this abuse to happen in the first place. And by listening to the stories of survivors, they're making sure that those lived experiences are shaping their investigations and recommendations.
It's a massive undertaking, and they're set to be fully up and running early next year. It just goes to show that protecting children is a constant battle. It requires vigilance, accountability, and a willingness to confront those uncomfortable truths.
It's about acknowledging where things went wrong and creating a better system that truly prioritizes the safety and well-being of the most vulnerable children.
Absolutely. Now, on a more concerning note, New Zealand is dealing with a whooping cough epidemic, and infants are the ones who are most at risk.
This resurgence of whooping cough, it reminds us how important vaccinations are and how vulnerable those who can't be vaccinated are. The number of cases has really spiked recently, and it shows just how important proactive public health measures are.
Health officials are really urging everyone, especially parents of young babies and pregnant women, to make sure their vaccinations are up to date. Whooping cough can be incredibly dangerous for newborns, it can cause really severe coughing fits, and it can even lead to pneumonia.
It's a stark reminder of how crucial vaccinations are for public health. By getting vaccinated, you're not just protecting yourself, you're protecting those around you who might be more vulnerable.
Exactly. And thankfully, there's a national response team working to get this outbreak under control and protect those who are most at risk. It just shows how quickly public health emergencies can develop and how important it is to have a coordinated response.
It also highlights the need for good public health education and outreach. People need clear and accurate information to understand the risks, take preventative measures, and make informed decisions about their health.
All right, let's switch gears again to something a bit more, well, positive. New Zealand's export strategy.
Right. They've got this ambitious plan to double their exports over the next 10 years. It's a sign that they really want to expand their global economic footprint and build on their strengths.
And they're not putting all their eggs in one basket either. They're focusing on securing diverse trade agreements, and they're working on removing barriers that are holding back their export growth.
It's a proactive approach that recognizes just how important international trade is in today's globalized economy. By diversifying their trading partners and addressing those market barriers, they're setting themselves up for sustainable economic growth and building resilience against future shocks.
They've already scored some big wins too, like the early implementation of the EU Free Trade Agreement and a new partnership with the UAE. Plus, they're working on tackling barriers for their key exports, like trying to get better access for their dairy products in Canada.
It's all about being strategic and engaging with the global marketplace. They're using their strengths to boost their economy and create opportunities for businesses to thrive.
And it's not just about making more money. This export push is about creating jobs, raising incomes, and building a more prosperous future for New Zealanders.
It's a vision for a more connected and vibrant New Zealand, one that leverages its unique assets and resources to compete on a global scale.
Now, on the international relations front, New Zealand's making a pretty big move by participating in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly for the first time ever.
It's a historic moment, for sure. It shows a willingness to get more involved in global security issues. By joining the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, they're demonstrating their commitment to working together with other nations and engaging in international diplomacy.
The Assembly is a platform for parliamentarians from NATO countries to discuss, well, pretty much every major global security challenge you can think of. New Zealand's delegation will be part of conversations about everything from democracy and disinformation to the conflict in Ukraine.
It's a chance for New Zealand to share their views, learn from other countries, and contribute to shaping the international response to some of the most pressing issues we're all facing.
It's like New Zealand's taking a seat at the global table and making sure their voice is heard.
It's a recognition that global security is everyone's responsibility, and that even a relatively small country like New Zealand has a role to play in creating a more peaceful and stable world.
And speaking of the global landscape, let's take a look at the economic outlook for New Zealand. It seems things aren't recovering quite as quickly as they'd hoped.
Yeah, this slower than expected recovery, it's a reflection of those global economic headwinds that are affecting so many countries right now. Consumer spending is down, manufacturing is slowing, the service sector is sluggish. It's all contributing to this more gradual recovery.
The Treasury's chief economist, Dominic Stevens, he said that growth will probably be pushed back beyond the second half of next year. And to make things even more complicated, the government's getting less tax revenue from GST, which is hitting your budget pretty hard.
These economic indicators, they paint a picture of a recovery that's more fragile and less even than we initially thought. And this drop in government revenue, it makes it even harder for them to balance the budget and provide essential services.
It's not just the short-term challenges they're dealing with either. New Zealand's also got those longer-term issues to grapple with, like low productivity, an aging population, and of course, climate change.
These are big structural issues that need long-term solutions and innovative policies. If they want to ensure New Zealand's economic and social well-being in the long run, they need to address productivity, demographic changes, and climate change head-on.
It's a lot to deal with for sure, but even with all these challenges, there's still potential for growth. Private investment, technological advancements, and stronger international connections could all contribute to a more positive outlook.
Absolutely. It's not all doom and gloom. New Zealand has the potential to build a more dynamic and resilient economy, one that can weather those future storms. They just need to foster innovation, attract investment, and leverage those global connections.
So true. Okay, now let's bring things back down to earth, shall we? Let's talk about something everyone can relate to, the shrinking purchasing power of the New Zealand dollar.
Ah, inflation. It's a global problem, and New Zealand's feeling it too. It's a concrete example of how those big economic trends translate into real-world impacts for people.
Yeah, like these days, your New Zealand dollar might get you a handful of almonds, a single bread roll, or maybe a discounted DVD. You might find a deal on tinned tomatoes at the supermarket, or even a chocolate bar for under $1. But as economist Shamubeel Eklub points out, in the past, that same dollar could have gotten you a whole block of butter.
It's amazing, isn't it? It shows you how inflation eats away at the value of money over time. It underscores the need for policies that prioritize affordability and protect the purchasing power of everyday people.
It's a bit of a wake-up call, really. It highlights how important it is to understand your personal finances, especially when the economy's a bit shaky. Making smart choices about spending and saving is more crucial than ever.
Couldn't agree more. Financial literacy is key.
Okay, now remember that treaty principles bill we talked about earlier? Well, that debate's still raging on, and it's led to some pretty dramatic scenes both inside and outside Parliament.
It really has. The bill's triggered so much passionate debate and protest, and it's exposed these deep divisions in New Zealand society. It's all about how they understand the Treaty of Waitangi and what it means for the relationship between Maori and the government.
There was this huge hikoi, which is a traditional Maori protest march, with something like 42,000 people marching on Parliament to oppose the bill. And then things got even more intense inside Parliament itself.
Oh yeah, a Te Pāti Maori MP, Hanarawiti Maipi Clark, she tore up a copy of the bill right there in protest, and then her party members started performing a haka. The whole session had to be suspended. It was this powerful display of opposition and a reminder that politics can be incredibly emotional and symbolic.
It's clear that this bill has struck a nerve, and it's raising these really fundamental questions about identity, rights, and the whole process of reconciliation in New Zealand.
For sure, it's a complex and sensitive issue, and those strong reactions just highlight the high stakes. The Treaty of Waitangi is such a foundational document for New Zealand, and interpretations of its principles, they continue to shape the relationship between Maori and the government to this day.
Absolutely. The government's coalition partners are calling for stricter rules in Parliament to prevent these kinds of disruptions from happening again. But there are also calls for something, well, more constructive, a new national Maori forum that would focus on unity and finding common ground.
That's a really important point. It's not enough to just maintain order. They need to create spaces for dialogue and understanding, especially when it comes to such a sensitive and complex issue. Having a national forum dedicated to addressing the Treaty of Waitangi and working towards reconciliation, that could be a real step towards bridging those divides and finding solutions that work for everyone.
It's a good reminder that even when people disagree strongly, there's still room for empathy, for understanding, and for working towards shared goals.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A healthy democracy needs both passionate debate and a willingness to listen and find common ground.
Well said. And finally, let's end this part on some good news for international students in New Zealand. They've made some changes to the post-study work visa criteria, making things a bit more flexible.
These changes, they show that New Zealand recognizes the value that international students bring to the country. By making it easier for students to gain work experience after they graduate, they're making New Zealand a more attractive destination for those who want to develop their skills and build their careers.
So now, students who go from a postgraduate diploma to a master's degree can still apply for a post-study work visa, even if their master's program is shorter than 30 weeks. And they've aligned some qualifications with the Green List, which basically opens up more opportunities for people in high-demand sectors like teaching and engineering.
These changes show that New Zealand is willing to adapt to the needs of international students. It makes the country a more welcoming and supportive place for them. It's a win-win. Students get valuable experience and maybe even a path to staying in the country, while New Zealand benefits from their skills and contributions.
It's a smart move, especially in a world where everyone's competing for talented workers.
It's a recognition that attracting and keeping skilled people is crucial for a country's success. And it doesn't matter where those people come from.
Well, we've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive into New Zealand, from political showdowns and economic worries to social movements and public health concerns. It's been quite the journey.
It has. And what's really fascinating is that so many of these issues, they're not unique to New Zealand. We're seeing similar challenges and debates playing out all over the world.
It just goes to show we're all part of this global community, facing similar problems and sharing the responsibility of trying to build a better future.
Exactly. And as we continue our deep dive into New Zealand, think about these connections. How do these events relate to your own life, your community, the world around you?
Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll explore these connections even further and see what broader lessons we can learn from what's happening in New Zealand.
Welcome back. We're diving back into the current events in New Zealand.
Yeah, let's pick up where we left off and dig a little deeper into some of those themes we were talking about and see how they connect to the bigger picture.
Okay, sounds good.
One thing that really stood out to me was New Zealand's economic situation. They seem to be facing a lot of the same challenges that we see in other developed countries: slow recovery, inflation, the whole works.
It's a common story, unfortunately. I mean, the pandemic, those supply chain problems, all the geopolitical stuff happening, it's all created this feeling of economic uncertainty. And that's playing out in people's everyday lives. The grocery store, the housing market, it's everywhere.
Yeah, you can really feel it. And that example of the $1 coin, how it doesn't buy nearly as much as it used to, that really hit home for me.
Yeah, it's a good illustration of how these big economic trends actually affect people's lives, their ability to afford basic necessities.
Definitely. It makes you think about the kinds of policies that are needed to make things more affordable, protect people from these economic ups and downs.
Exactly. It also highlights the importance of, being financially savvy.
Yeah.
Making informed decisions about spending, saving, and all that.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking of making choices, let's go back to that Treaty Principles Bill for a minute. It sparked this really important conversation about reconciliation and how New Zealand deals with its colonial history.
It's a conversation that's happening in a lot of countries right now.
Mm-hmm.
How do we deal with the legacy of colonialism and its impact on indigenous people?
It's a big question.
Yeah, it is. And the Treaty of Waitangi, that's such a foundational document for New Zealand. It continues to shape the relationship between the government and Maori, the indigenous people. How they interpret the treaty's principles plays a big role in that.
And you saw how much people care about these issues just from the protests, the hikoi, and all the drama that happened in Parliament.
It was intense. It was a reminder that these issues are deeply personal and emotional. And while it's important to have those discussions respectfully, those moments of tension, they can actually lead to growth and change. They force us to face uncomfortable truths and engage in those difficult conversations. And that can, well, hopefully lead to a more just society.
You're right. And those calls for a new national Maori forum, one that focuses on finding common ground and promoting unity, that seems like a good step.
I think so too. Creating a space for dialogue and collaboration where Maori voices are centered, that could be a real step towards meaningful reconciliation. It's about moving beyond symbolic gestures and putting in the work to build trust, understanding, and come up with solutions that work for everyone.
Absolutely. And that's something that applies to so many of the challenges we face, right? Whether it's climate change, political polarization, or just bridging divides within our own communities. It's all about open communication, being willing to listen, even when you disagree with someone.
You hit the nail on the head. Those are the principles that can lead to real progress.
So true. Now, let's talk about those changes to the post-study work visa criteria in New Zealand. That seems like a really smart move, especially in today's globalized world.
I agree. They're making New Zealand a more attractive place for international students, which is smart because talent is so mobile these days.
They're basically saying, hey, come study here, get some work experience, and maybe even stick around and contribute to our workforce.
It's a win-win. Students gain valuable skills and experience, and New Zealand gets to benefit from their talents and fresh perspectives. They're investing in their future.
Exactly. And by aligning certain qualifications with that green list, they're making it easier for graduates in high-demand fields to stay, which is a huge benefit. It shows they're really thinking long-term.
It's all about attracting and retaining skilled workers.
Right. And New Zealand's decision to join the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, that was a pretty big deal. It shows they're not shying away from engaging with global issues.
For sure, it's a significant change in their foreign policy. It shows they're willing to step up and be part of the conversation on security and diplomacy.
Their participation in the assembly gives them a platform to share their perspective and contribute to finding solutions for those global challenges like, well, disinformation, cyber attacks, the whole conflict in Ukraine. It's a big deal.
It's a reminder that no country is an island. You know, we all need to work together to address these complex issues.
Absolutely. And that reminds me of those efforts to control the whooping cough epidemic.
Yeah.
It just highlights how public health is a global issue, and it requires global cooperation. We're seeing those vaccine-preventable diseases making a comeback in lots of places, partly because of misinformation and vaccine hesitancy.
Yeah, it's concerning. It underscores the importance of reliable health care, public health education, and communicating scientific information clearly. New Zealand's focus on promoting vaccination is a good example of how to proactively protect vulnerable populations and build immunity within a community.
It shows how individual choices can affect everyone and how important it is to act responsibly when it comes to public health. We're all connected in that way.
Exactly. Now, stepping back for a moment, it's fascinating to see how all these seemingly separate events in New Zealand are actually connected to those bigger global trends.
It's like New Zealand is a microcosm of what's happening in the world. The debates about reconciliation, the economic anxieties, the focus on attracting talent, the concerns about health, those are all playing out on a global scale.
It's like we're all in the same boat trying to navigate these choppy waters. And by looking at what's happening in different parts of the world, like New Zealand, we can get a better understanding of the forces that are shaping our lives.
Absolutely. So as we continue to explore New Zealand in our next segment, keep those connections in mind. Think about how these events relate to your own life, your community, and the world around you.
Stay curious and keep asking those questions. There's a lot to learn from what's happening in New Zealand. We'll delve into those lessons in our final part.
All right, welcome back to our final part of this deep dive on New Zealand. We've covered a lot of ground, from politics to the economy, social issues, even whooping cough. What are your thoughts on everything we've talked about so far?
It's been fascinating, really. New Zealand, in a way, it's like a microcosm of what so many countries are going through right now. They're grappling with these big issues, just like the rest of the world.
It really does feel that way. And what's interesting is how all these seemingly separate events, they're actually interconnected in so many ways.
You're absolutely right. Take that debate over the Treaty Principles Bill, for example. It's not just about the legal wording or clarifying principles. It's about coming to terms with past wrongs, figuring out what it means to belong in a nation, and ultimately shaping a better future for everyone.
It's a really powerful example of how those conversations about reconciliation, acknowledging the past, and trying to create a more inclusive future, how those conversations are happening everywhere.
Yeah, we're seeing it in so many countries. People are grappling with the legacy of colonialism, discrimination, inequality, and it's not easy. These issues are deep-rooted, and they require more than just policy changes. It takes a real commitment to understanding, empathy, and a willingness to challenge those long-held assumptions.
And those conversations can get messy, right? Like we saw with those protests, the March on Parliament, that whole scene inside Parliament.
Absolutely. It can get heated and emotions run high, but those moments of tension, they can also be opportunities for growth. They force us to confront things we might not want to see, have those difficult conversations, and hopefully work towards a more just and equitable society.
It's about finding that balance, recognizing the pain of the past, but also focusing on building a future where everyone feels valued and respected. And that takes a lot of patience, understanding, and a willingness to listen, even when you don't agree with someone.
So true. And those principles, they apply to so many of the challenges we face, not just reconciliation. Take the economy, for instance. Those economic problems New Zealand's dealing with, slow recovery, inflation, those are global issues.
Yeah, it seems like every developed country is wrestling with the same things. The pandemic, global tensions, those disrupted supply chains. It's created a really uncertain economic environment.
It has, and it's affecting everyone, from governments trying to manage their budgets to individuals struggling to afford groceries. It really underscores the need for global cooperation, innovation, and adaptability if we want to find solutions.
And one way countries are adapting is by focusing on attracting and retaining talent from all over the world. Those changes to the post-study work visa in New Zealand, that's a good example.
Yeah, by making it easier for international students to gain work experience and potentially stay in the country, they're making themselves a really attractive destination for those skilled workers. It's a smart move in today's competitive global market.
They're basically saying, come study here, share your skills, contribute to our society. And I think that open, welcoming approach is something a lot of countries are realizing is crucial for success.
It is. It's about recognizing that diversity is a strength, that welcoming people from different backgrounds enriches a society.
Mm.
And that's not just about the economy, it's about building a more vibrant and inclusive culture.
Absolutely. And New Zealand's decision to join the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, that was a pretty big statement too. They're not just focusing inward, they're actively engaging in those global dialogues about security and diplomacy.
It's a significant shift for them. It shows they're ready to play a role in the world stage, and they're committed to collaborating with other nations to address those big global challenges.
Yeah, like the conflict in Ukraine, disinformation campaigns, cyber threats, all those things that, well, affect all of us. It's a reminder that we're not isolated, that we have a responsibility to engage with those global issues and work towards a more peaceful and secure world.
Exactly. And those efforts to control the whooping cough epidemic, they highlight something else that's crucial: international cooperation in public health. We've seen a resurgence of vaccine-preventable diseases in many places, and it underscores the need for global health initiatives, accurate information, and access to health care for everyone.
It's a reminder that protecting public health requires a collective effort. It's about sharing knowledge, resources, and strategies to ensure the well-being of people all over the world.
You've hit on a key theme that's run through this entire deep dive: interconnectedness. What happens in one part of the world affects us all, and finding solutions requires global cooperation, empathy, and a willingness to learn from each other.
Well said. And as we wrap up our exploration of New Zealand, I'm struck by how much we can learn from their experiences. They're grappling with these big questions about identity, belonging, reconciliation, economic uncertainty, global responsibility, and they're doing it with a spirit of innovation, collaboration, and a commitment to building a better future.
It's inspiring, really. It reminds us that even amidst challenges, there's always hope and opportunity. And it encourages us to stay curious, stay engaged, and stay connected, because the world is full of stories waiting to be discovered.
And we'll be here to dive into those stories with you. Thanks for joining us on this journey across the ditch to New Zealand. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.